social partner senators to be members and for the chairperson to be a member of the opposition in the House of Representatives, but departs to provide for situations when members of the opposition in the House are unwilling to act as chairperson or when there is no opposition member in the House of Representatives, for a member of the opposition in the Senate to be appointed chairperson, and where the members of the opposition in the Senate are unwilling to act in this capacity, for a social partner senator to be appointed chairperson. Madam President, that's the report. And just like to point out that the members of the committee was chaired by yourself, Madam President, as Honorable Caroline Trent Standiford, President of the Senate, a member, the Honorable Colette Montejo, Vice President of the Senate, representing the government side, myself representing the opposition bench, and the Honorable Janelle Chanona representing the social partner bench. That is the report, Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Perfeet. Thank you, Senator Perfeet, for presenting the report on behalf of the chair, and thank you also for those kind words prior to presenting the report. I now call upon Senator Erica Jang. I recognize Senator Erica Jang.
Madam President, I rise to lay on the table sessional paper number 101/1/14, report from the House Committee on Matters Relating to Remuneration, Allowances, and the Comfort and Convenience of Senators. The House Committee was appointed on 9th March 2021 in accordance with the Standing Order 64, Standing Order 66(1)(a), places a duty upon the committee to consider and advise the President upon all matters relating to the remuneration and allowances and the comfort and convenience of senators, and B, employment of officers and other persons by the Senate. Paragraph 4 of the said standing orders places a duty on the said committee to report its minute of proceedings from time to time to the Senate. This is the first report of the committee for this 14th parliamentary session. Since its appointment, the committee has held 7 meetings where it deliberated on a number of matters. The committee is pleased to report to the Senate the following. The committee is commissioned a Belize Senate survey of services and remuneration and allowances during February to March 2023 to gauge perception and to provide concrete information around remuneration and allowances and supporting services in order to make a determination as to whether the former is commensurable with the work senators are expected to do, whether the latter provided by the National Assembly enables the highest level of performance, and whether both enable the prioritization of their work. 2. On the matters of remuneration and allowances, the committee noted a previous initiative of the Joint Select Parliamentary Committee Report 2003 of the National Assembly in addressing this matter. In addition, it undertook a comparative analysis for regional and global best practices, considering the implications of historical, contemporary, and emerging environmental factors to the scope of work of the Senate, as well as its powers and functions contained in its standing orders and Constitution of Belize. Plan Belize, the current comprehensive review of the standing orders of the Senate and Constitution of Belize, respectively, and the existing protocols relating to remuneration, allowances, benefits, and supporting services for senators. 3. Some of the key findings of the committee's work upon which it deliberated are as follows. The absence of the mechanism for a structured and comprehensive review of remuneration, allowances, and comfort and confidence of members of the Senate and the President of the Senate, and the practice of addressing them every 20 to 22 years, with the last review in 2003. The evolution of the composition of the Senate, both in quantity and representative groups during this period, underscoring the distinction between roles of members of the Senate and the President of the Senate, generally as legislators, yet also having varying responsibilities and serving in distinct capacities and positions. In addition, that of being a legislator, these positions include Vice President of the Senate, Leader of Government Business, Leader of the Opposition Business, Coordinator of the Social Partners Bench, Chairpersons and members of Sessional Select and Special Select Committees, and Joint Parliamentary Committees, as well as representing the National Assembly in various national, regional, and global meetings. The increase and intensification of the work of the Senate, which has become more complex since 2003, and more so since December 2020, demanding a corresponding level of effort by both members of the Senate, approximately 12 days per month, and the President of the Senate, approximately 15 days per month, in the performance of their respective duties and responsibilities. Next point. The discounting of complementary role of the Senate plays to the House of Representatives, as well as the House of Legislature, which is one of three branches of government, and a lack of awareness by both state and non-state organizations and general public of the scope and magnitude of work of the Senate and generally to the operations of the legislature as an institution. The increase in national budget by 169.5%, fuel by 77.2% to 100% per gallon, and the cost of living accumulatively by 42.3% between 2003-2004 and 2003-2024, which have implications for oversight and scrutiny. Ambiguity in what the payment of some allowances ought to be, resulting in discretionary, subjective, and often arbitrary applications and compensations of allowances for both members of the Senate and the President of the Senate, and the consequences of the practice, which may result in unfairness and being contrary to best practices in hierarchical reporting relationship, and the apparent difference between the salaries and allowances approved by the motion of the Senate in 2003 and that which is currently being implemented, as well as between the allowances and benefits afforded to members of staff, public officers, and other parliamentarians, and not to members of the Senate and President of the Senate. Also, lack of knowledge of some benefits and supporting services of the Senate by members of the Senate. 4. The committee concluded that the current remuneration allowances and supporting services package compromises the prioritization of the work of the Senate by both members of the Senate and the President of the Senate, and this ought to be addressed if the Senate is to fulfill its legally mandated oversight and scrutiny role in the Belize's democracy. 5. The committee deliberated on and agreed upon a number of measures to enable members of the Senate and the President of the Senate to prioritize the work of the Senate such that it delivers on its legal duty and mandate as derived from the Constitution of Belize and the standing orders of the Senate and the principles of parliamentary practice and Plan Belize. These include: 1. Sharing the work of the Senate, its evolution, intensification, and resulting complexity to bring attention to the extreme disparity between remuneration and allowances of parliamentarians, specifically members of the Senate and the President of the Senate, in comparison to the other branches of government and statutory agencies, and that this ought to be addressed in any future review of the same. 2. Conveying its support of the recommendation of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association benchmark for democratic legislature, which stipulates at 1.5.2 that an independent body or mechanism should determine the remuneration, benefits, and other statutory entitlements of legislators. 3, requesting the payment of salaries and all allowances to members of the Senate and the President of the Senate to be affected by the National Assembly to provide for the comprehensive documentation of all payments made to them and to eliminate the practice of seeking information from the Ministry of Finance on allowances that are paid by them when such information is required. 4, coordinating the compilation of comprehensive policy with guidelines and explanations of remuneration and allowances of members of the Senate and the President of the Senate for knowledge, clarity, and ease of application. 5, seeking clarity on the authority of the reduction of salaries from members of the Senate and the President of the Senate from that which was approved by the Senate motion on 5th August 2003 to what is being implemented. 6, regularizing the application of these same subsistence allowances that is afforded to members of the public service as per Compendium of Allowance for the Belize Public Service, October 2014, for members of the Senate and the President of the Senate. 7, regularizing the application of the allowance for the Vice President of the Senate, as is the practice of the Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives, with effect from the date the Vice President was elected. 8, regularizing the application for the allowances of the chairpersons of sessional special select committees, as is the practice for that of the House of Representatives and joint parliamentary committees and members of the said committee, with effect from the date the resolution was passed in the Senate for the establishment of these committees. 9, seeking approval for the option of an insurance allowance for members of the Senate and the President of the Senate in lieu of participation in the National Assembly Group's insurance scheme in case of either of them having a pre-existing insurance before their appointment to the Senate. 10, revising the National Assembly of Belize Induction Handbook for the new members 2020 draft to include provisions for remuneration, allowances, and supporting services for members of the Senate, and to produce a similar handbook for the President of the Senate. And 11, seeking the support of the Minister of Finance for interim measures to provide for increases in existing remuneration and allowances, and to introduce new allowances to provide for fairness in the payment of remuneration and allowances to members of the Senate, the President of the Senate, in consideration of the extent and levels of effort they put into their workload. The committee underscored that this is in accordance with the practice of applying such measures every 20 years, of confirming to the percentage increases of the motions approved in 2003, of taking into consideration fuel and other costs of living increases for the period, of the unique composition of the Senate and distinct roles and responsibilities of members of the Senate and the President of the Senate, and similar benefits afforded to staff, public service office, and other parliamentarians, and advised that these come into effect 1st April 2024 and remain in effect until the National Assembly adopt other measures recommended by either the People's Constitutional Commission or a joint parliamentary committee established for this purpose. The members of the House Committee are Chairperson, President of the Senate, Honorable Caroline Trent Sandiford, members myself representing the government bench, member Honorable Michael Perifit representing the opposition bench, and member the Honorable Kevin Herrera representing the social partners bench. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Erica Jang, for presenting that report on behalf of the chair and the committee. I recognize Senator Bevington Cal.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning to my colleagues and, of course, to the Belizean people. Madam President, I rise to lay on the table sessional paper number 102/1/14, report from the Committee of Privileges on matters which appears to affect the powers and privileges of the Senate. Madam President, I rarely agree with my colleague, Senator Perfit, but I will be distinct in what I agree in with what he said. First, Madam President, I will also like to congratulate you with the work that you have done. I think you have moved the Senate to another level. You have activated the many committees that should have been activated years ago, but it was not done, Madam President. I think we need to highlight that. But with your leadership, you ensured that these committees were activated and doing the work that they should have been doing. And of course, that also takes a lot of toll on us, you know, having to come to a lot of these meetings. But again, Madam President, I think that serving in this capacity is a privilege, and all of us made that effort. Of course, with your leadership, we could have done that. However, what I do not agree with Senator Mike is that the UDP will definitely, I don't know which UDP too, but they will definitely not win this election, Madam President. I just wanted to be distinct on what I agreed on. I'm not debating. Madam President, the Committee of Privileges was appointed on March 2021 in accordance with the Standing Order 64. Standing Order 67-1 requires any matter which appears to affect the powers or privileges of the Senate to be referred to the committee. And it shall be the duty of the committee to consider any matter so referred and to report thereon to the Senate. This is the first report of the committee for this 14th parliamentary session. Since its appointment, the committee has held 3 meetings where it deliberated upon a number of matters. The committee is pleased to bring to the notice of the Senate the following. 1, very important, Madam President. Of course, in partnership with the CPA, the committee deliberated on and completed a draft code of conduct for senators, the purpose of which is to encourage ethical conduct and to uphold the democratic principles of the National Assembly and to reduce risk of the integrity of the National Assembly. In partnership again, Madam President, with the CPA, the committee deliberated on and completed a set of draft guidelines for the establishment of a joint parliamentary conduct and ethics committee to report to the Senate from time to time on any real changes in the code of conduct that it deems desirable, to receive, investigate, and report upon any complaints or departures by members from the code of conduct, and to determine the procedures for the operation of the committee and the extent of its powers. 3, Madam President, the committee deliberated on and agreed to improving collaboration with the police department to reduce incidents of senators being obstructed from their duties as provided for in Section 19D of the Legislative Assembly Powers and Privileges Ordinance Number 23 of 1962. The committee deliberated on and supported the concept of a logo license plate that identify the National Assembly as the legislative branch of the government of Belize. Number 5, the committee deliberated on and supported the provision of business cards for senators. Madam President, I want to thank you on this, and of course the staff of the National Assembly. When we go out on international duties, Madam President, this helps us a lot to collaborate and connect with, you know, our fellow parliamentarians across the globe, Madam President. So this helps us, and we greatly appreciate that. Number 6, the committee deliberated on and supported the review, strengthening, and modernization of the Legislative Assembly Powers and Privileges Ordinance 23 of 1962, an act prior to independence of Belize. This act defines the powers and privileges and immunities of the Legislative Assembly and of members of the Legislative Assembly in a unicameral setting with a speaker. Since its enactment, the Legislative Assembly has evolved into the National Assembly with the bicameral setting of the 2 houses, the 2 presiding officers, namely the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the President of the Senate. The committee noted the need to review the National Assembly of Belize induction handbook for new members to include senators and presiding officers. This book serves as a guideline and reference points on matters concerning the welfare of members, parliamentary staff, the administration of Parliament, resources available, and relevant details pertaining to allowances, pensions, insurance, and the topic of conduct and other parliamentary business. Madam President, the members of this Committee of Privileges is of course chaired by you, the President of the Senate, myself representing the government bench, the Honorable Antonio Herrera representing the opposition bench, the Honorable Glenfield Denison representing the social partners bench. The committee, Madam President, also places on the record the contribution of former Senator, the Honorable Elena Smith, who served on the committee during these deliberations. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Cull, for presenting on behalf of the chair and the committee. I now recognize Senator the Honorable Alvin Moses Bengushe.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, like my previous colleagues, I want to put on record and express thanks to you as President of the Senate. I just want to add to that for me personally speaking, I must admit that your personality and easy approach was made comfortable for me to be able to call you at any given time, and especially to have received advice on any matter. And so I want to place on record my deep appreciation and my thanks to you, personally speaking. Madam President and members of the Senate, I rise to lay on table the sessional paper number 103/1/14, report from the Regulations Committee on the matters relating to the regulations that are to be laid before the Senate. Madam President, indulge me for at least a minute or two, just to bring to the attention of the Senate and to the nation the death of one Cornelius Patrick Carcho, a fellow Dangrigan and a Garifuna, one who has given yeoman service to this nation and to the world at large, especially in his capacity of having served the World Bank. Cornelius Carcho was born in 1926, and there are a lot of us here who would not be familiar with even that time. But Madam President, as a young man growing up in Dangriga and actually attending ecumenical high school, and I'm certain that Senator Jang would be familiar, that here was a gentleman that we only heard of, and one who teachers would perhaps share with us about, but one who, from what we heard, was a respectable person who came back after having served or having studied abroad, came back to serve his country, and in the post of economic secretary and the head of a planning unit under the Honorable George Cadle Price. And then, after having served his country, went to the World Bank and worked with them for 30 plus years. But in addition to that, I think what is important to note, especially for us who might not have heard of him, is one who contributed sacrificially and financially to institutions within our country. I know the Methodist Church especially has benefited tremendously. The University of the West Indies, the extension program, benefited tremendously from his contribution. And what I do know that in Dangriga itself, there is a library that he and his family established for young children. And so I just wanted us to be aware of the death of Cornelius Patrick Culture, one who contributed significantly to nation building. Thank you very much. Madam President, the Regulations Committee was appointed on the 19th March 2021 in accordance with Standing Order 64 and requires the committee to consider all such regulation as defined by the interpretation act for the time being in force as under the authority of any law are to be laid before the Senate and to bring to the special attention of the Senate any regulation or draft. A, which involves the expenditure of public monies or imposes or fixes fees for a license or for services. B, which cannot be challenged in the courts on the ground that it is ultra-virus or is only temporarily so challengeable. And C, the making of which appears to constitute an unusual or unexpected use of the powers conferred by the law under which it was made. D, which purports to have retroactive effects, although the law under which it was made does not in turn give the minister such a power. E, the publication or the laying before the Senate of which appears to have been unduly delayed. And F, in respect of which there has been unjustifiable delay in notifying the President that the instrument had come into operation before it was laid before the Senate. Or G, the purport or form of which appears to require elucidation. This is the first report of the committee for this 14th parliamentary session and is done in accordance with Standing Order 75, which provides for a select committee to make a special report relating to its powers, functions, and proceedings on any matter that gives it fit to bring to the notice of the Senate. Since its appointment, the committee has held 6 meetings where it deliberated on a number of matters. The committee is pleased to bring to the notice of the Senate the following. 1, the committee deliberated on and agreed to capacity building sessions with the Attorney General's Ministry to enhance knowledge and understanding of the duties and responsibilities of the committee as per the requirement of Standing Order 68-1. 2, the committee deliberated on and agreed to conduct a stock take of statutory instruments signed for the years 2021, 22, 23, and 24 to provide the committee with information on the total number of regulations signed by year, whether they were subject to affirmative, negative, or no resolution, and the dates they were published in the Gazette and tabled in the National Assembly. This provided a starting point for the work of the committee and revealed that 160, 177, and 120 statutory instruments were signed in 2021, 22, and 23 respectively, and preliminary data suggests that a number of the regulations which under the authority of the law are to be laid before the Senate have not been so laid. And 3, considering that the Attorney General's Ministry is engaged in a similar exercise of stock taking of regulations to bring those regulations which under the authority of the law are to be laid before the Senate, the committee deliberated on and agreed to share its findings with the Attorney General's Ministry and to collaborate on this task. And 4, the committee deliberated on the absence of a time limit within which regulations subject to negative resolutions are to lie on the table before the Senate and for such recommendations to be considered in a revision of the Standing orders. 5, the committee deliberated and noted the time, resources, and research capacity required for conducting the work of the committee. 6, the committee deliberated on and agreed upon a quarterly calendar with work packages and supported the engagement of a parliamentary legal counsel for the National Assembly to provide technical advice to the committee in the carrying out of its work. And 7, in the interim, the committee deliberated on and agreed to collaborate with the Attorney General's ministry in bringing to the Senate as soon as possible any outstanding statutory instrument for consideration by the committee and for it to report to the Senate as may be necessary. 8, the committee deliberated on and supported making all statutory instruments accessible to the public from the National Assembly website. And this I found quite an interesting part of the conversation that we had in that committee, because I thought that that was very necessary and continues to be so, especially in this day and age when young people, especially, Madam President, are seeking information concerning the work of the government. And 9, the members of the Committee of Regulations, thankfully, are the chairperson, yourself, Madam President Caroline Trench-Staniford, and the members from the government bench, Honorable Isabel Bennett Moody, representing the opposition, the Honorable Mark O'Brien, and myself representing the social partners, A. Moses Bengushe. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bengushe, for presenting the report on behalf of the chair and for your kind words.
Madam President, there is an important part, because sometimes we miss these things. The last part of we place on record the thanks to Senator Beverly Williams and Senator the Honorable Sheena Pitts for the contribution that they made, especially my sister, Senator Pitts, who in the interim and the first part of the committee's sitting would have given so much support and oversight. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bengushe. Honorable members, those papers of the 4 sessional select committees of the Senate are ordered to lie on the table.
Personal explanations.
I recognize Senator Janelle Chinona.
Good morning. I rise on behalf of the Women's Parliamentary Caucus. Thank you, Mr. President. I rise on behalf of the Women's Parliamentary Caucus to share a summary of the work of the WPC since its establishment as a joint standing committee in May 2023. In 2023, UNICEF and the UN Women partnered to support the capacity development and institutional strengthening of the Women's Parliamentary Caucus of Belize to effectively fulfill our mandate as a joint standing committee on gender equality. A key output from that partnership is a strategic work plan which aligns with and is supported by the Ministry of Human Development, which identifies 6 strategic priority areas which will guide the work of the WPC through to 2026. These include gender responsive policy and legislation, institutional strengthening and capacity development, advocacy and oversight, citizen engagement and participation, strategic alliances, networking and knowledge sharing, communication and visibility. Key national activities executed by the WPC include presenting and participating at fora dedicated to understanding and advancing human rights issues in Belize, organizing a training for parliamentarians on anti-human trafficking measures, and increasing the awareness and meaningful implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. The attendance of members of the caucus to international conferences, such as the Multi-Stakeholder Dialogue on Gender Equality and Sustainable Development, as well as the 14th Regional Conference of the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians, has also provided invaluable insight and best practice exchange among Caribbean women's parliamentary caucuses. Moving forward will be key, and we acknowledge the support of our male colleagues who have supported these efforts, and we look forward to more of the same in the next parliamentary session. The caucus makes particular mention of the support from parliamentarians Honorable Jorge Melin-Espat, Honorable Karim Musa, and the good Senator Alvin Moses Benguche for their support of the activities of the WPC during this parliamentary session. I also wish to recognize the clerk and her team for their invaluable technical assistance to the Women's Parliamentary Caucus. As chair and as a personal note, I thank all the members for their individual and collective commitment to the WPC to advance equality and equity. I recognize the presiding officers, Speaker Honorable Valerie Woods, Madam President Carolyn Trench-Sandiford, Honorable Dolores Balaramas Garcia, Honorable Elvia Vega, Honorable Tracy Tager-Panton, Honorable Isabel Bennett Moody, Honorable Erica Jang, as well as Senators Elena Smith and Beverly Williams, for their dedication and distinguished representation in our unique caucus. I have learned much from and about each of you, about the machinations of Parliament and about myself, lessons I take forward in service of our beloved Belize. I thank you.
I recognize Senator Bevington Carlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam President, I rise to make a personal statement on the work that is happening in Plan Belize in southern Belize, Madam President. And this is not a campaign statement, Madam President. This is basically translating what the people of the South is saying, and especially in Toledo East, Madam President. And I invite you and everyone in the Senate for the Easter holidays to come to PG. We are now marketing PG, Punta Gorda, as the chocolate capital, Madam President, because as you're aware, the prices of chocolate has gone up significantly, and Toledo is the breadbasket for chocolate. So, Madam President, the farmers are getting really good prices for their cacao beans right now. So, and of course, we have the chocolate festival coming up. So we invite everyone, and of course you, Madam President, and to come and really see the transformation of Plan Belize in Toledo East, and of course Toledo West included, Madam President. But Madam President, from the people of Toledo East give a huge mandate to this government, and of course we need to deliver on that, Madam President. So the work that is happening, Madam President, the infrastructure transformation that is happening in Toledo East right now, Madam President, is unprecedented, something that we have not seen for years, for the last 3 decades, from what I'm being told. And I'm only here to translate what the people are saying. No, I'm just telling you what I am from there, so I need to tell you, Senator Perfit, and I invite you to come to really see, because you have not been there. So, Madam President, the free education that is rolling out, we have NHI in full effect. We have, Madam President, I want you to go to the front street right now where they're cementing the entire front street. We have the marina coming up, Madam President. we have, hopefully, with one of my friends, we have more employment coming up for the residents of Toledo, Madam President. But the Maya communities, Madam President, were abandoned for so long. And this is really close to being, Madam President, because for years and years we have had school buses on the news being unable to reach Corazon Creek Technical High School, Madam President. And even with the amount of rainfall that we're having right now, Madam President, I can tell you, and this makes me really happy that we can have our kids reaching to school on time, because we have, you know, and of course I want to thank MIDH, Minister Julius Espat, for all the work and that they're doing, Madam President, because now, like I told you, the students can reach on time. They have replaced a lot of the culverts that were there for years, and now they're doing replacing it with climate resilient culvert, Madam President.
Members, be mindful that we must not disrupt
I have
another
10 minutes
senator
based on the
when
standing
they are
orders, so relax.
doing their presentation.
Let me proceed, Madam President. The streets in each communities right now is like, these people have never seen this for years, Madam President. And of course, we want to thank the Ministry of Finance, our Prime Minister, for allocating these funds in the supplementary budget, Madam President. And that is really what is translating. What Toledo is seeing right now, Madam President, is the value for money. When you put money where it belongs, Madam President, you see the outcome that we're having right now in the Toledo district. And of course, I need to highlight the Honorable Dr. Osmond Martinez, Madam President. His victory was over 70%, Madam President. I hope the camera catch you the clap for Osmond Martinez.
Proceed, Senator, proceed.
Madam President, the work that this gentleman is doing, Madam President, I mean, when you have walked the walk, Madam President, you know the struggles of the people. When you come from a poor background and you know, grow up and go up the ladder, Madam President, you know what it is like. You know the realities of these people, Madam President, and this man has the people at heart, Madam President. And you can see that, you can feel that, Madam President, you know, and just to go back, not to be repetitive, Madam President, when my colleague told you about that hype that you bring in the Senate, Madam President, that's the hype that we have in Toledo East right now, the hype of more things to come, right? More things to come, Madam President, and we want to assure, at least from Plan Belize, as we continue, Plan Belize either 2.0 or stay on track or right on track, Madam President. I know that Toledo East is right on track because we are delivering to the people of this country. And of course, Toledo, where I come from, Madam President, this was once the forgotten district, but I can tell you today it's not anymore. Everywhere you hear about Toledo East, not only in Belize, Minister Martinez was in Panama. Toledo East is mentioned. Let's focus on Toledo, because that was really my thing. Toledo is being highlighted. You go to the US, Toledo is being highlighted, Madam President. Now we have a lot of people excited to come and invest in the Toledo district, because the people now are realizing the potential that we have in the district, Madam President. We have all the wealth untold, as our national anthem. I believe that the Right Honorable George Price probably spent a lot of time in the Toledo district, Madam President, and he had to mention the wealth untold that is in Toledo district. That includes, we have the rainforest, we have the ocean, we have the island, we have everything. I'm aware of time, Madam President. I will wrap up. So, Madam President, I just really wanted to highlight the transformation that is happening in Toledo, especially Toledo East. The infrastructure, the road, we have new community centers, we have hurricane shelters, the cementing of street, the new bridges coming up, Madam President. I cannot wait. You know, our people will finally see something that, you know, it's hard to explain, Madam President, the feeling that our people will have. Well, we didn't make it happen, right? And that's the thing, we're making it happen. That's the biggest, you know, the pride that I have, Madam President, to be part of an entity, of an organization, of a party, of a government that is truly delivering to the people of this country, Madam President. And of course, I want to reiterate that the work of the Honorable Dr. Osmond Martinez is just amazing, Madam President. And of course, I want to send a strong message to the people of Toledo East. If you want to continue this, then let us be on track. Let us make sure that we work together with the minister. Madam President, I cannot go without, we cannot leave this presentation without mentioning Bella Vista, Madam President. Bella Vista is seeing the transformation that they've wanted for so long, Madam President. And of course, I want to thank the Deputy Prime Minister. He has been there twice. And for the last 4 months, Madam President, can you imagine that? Twice in the last 4 months, and we're going to deliver a lot of land documents to first-time landowners, Madam President. And I just have 1 more minute, Madam President. I believe that the only wealth we can give every single Belizean is land, Madam President. If you give people land, they're going to work the land, and they're going to produce, and they're going to make the best out of it, Madam President. So I want to thank the Minister, DPM Cordell Hyde, for all the hard work they've been doing, of course collaborating with Dr. Osmond Martinez, Madam President. We continue the work in the Toledo district. Thank you very much.
Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate.
I recognize the Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I move that at its rising today, the Senate adjourn to a date to be fixed by the President.
Honorable members, the question is that at its rising today, the Senate adjourn to a date to be fixed by the President. All those in favor, kindly say aye. Aye. Those against, kindly say no. The ayes have it.
Public business, government business motions.
I recognize the Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I move that whereas the Inter-Parliamentary Union was established in 1889 and is an international organization of the parliaments of sovereign states, and whereas the Inter-Parliamentary Union facilitates diplomacy and empowers parliaments and parliamentarians to promote peace, democracy, and sustainable development around the world, and whereas the National Assembly of Belize subscribes to the noble values advocated by the Inter-Parliamentary Union and to its work for the promotion of peace and security, democracy and human rights, the rule of law and sustainable development, and whereas the National Assembly of Belize recognizes that the existence of the Inter-Parliamentary Union as the global organization of national parliaments clearly attests to the willingness of nations to build strong ties of inter-parliamentary dialogue and cooperation with a view to better meeting the needs and expectations of citizens for a safer and more equitable world. And whereas the National Assembly of Belize also recognizes that interparliamentary contacts and cooperation, including on the South-South level, can in large measure help strengthen our institution and lead to a stronger engagement at the regional and international levels. And whereas the National Assembly of Belize is aware of the importance of the Interparliamentary Union in terms of bridging the democracy gap in international relations and forging a parliamentary component to the work of the United Nations. And whereas the National Assembly of Belize is desirous of becoming a member of the Interparliamentary Union, and whereas Article 3 of the Statutes of the Interparliamentary Union provides for every parliament constituted in conformity with the laws of a sovereign state, whose population it represents and on whose territory it functions, to request affiliation to the Interparliamentary Union. Now therefore be it resolved that this Honorable Senate authorizes the Speaker of the National Assembly to, in a sovereign and formal manner, request affiliation to the Interparliamentary Union and entrust the Speaker of the National Assembly to convey this resolution to the Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union.
Honorable members, that motion is referred to the Constitution and Foreign Affairs Committee for examination, consideration, and report. I recognize the Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I move that whereas Belize signed an agreement with the Government of the Republic of Korea on the 16th May 2024 relating to the framework agreement for grant aid between both parties, and whereas the purpose of the agreement is to promote poverty reduction and the sustainable economic and social development of Belize through grant aid, and to further strengthen the existing friendly relations between the two countries. And whereas on the basis of this agreement, parties shall carry out grant aid programs agreed upon by parties, and if necessary may conclude subsidiary agreements. And whereas the Government of Belize is desirous of ratifying the agreement pursuant to Article 9, and whereas Section 61A(2)(a) of the Belize Constitution, as amended by the Belize Constitution 6th Amendment Act No. 13 of 2008, provides that the Senate shall authorize the ratification of any treaty by the Government of Belize. Now, therefore, be it resolved that this Senate authorizes the Government of Belize to ratify the framework agreement for grant aid between the Government of Belize and the Government of the Republic of Korea.
Honorable members, that motion is referred to the Constitution and Foreign Affairs Committee for examination, consideration, and report. I recognize the Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I move that whereas Belize signed an agreement with the Government of the Republic of Korea on the 16th May 2024 relating to the Economic Development Cooperation Fund, hereafter referred to as the ECDF, and whereas the purpose of this agreement is to promote economic development of Belize and to promote cooperation between both countries, and whereas the financing arrangements are to be concluded between the borrower and the Export-Import Bank of Korea, and whereas the Government of Belize is desirous of ratifying the agreement pursuant to Article 14, and whereas Section 61A(2)(a) of the Belize Constitution, as amended by the Belize Constitution 6th Amendment Act No. 13 of 2008, provides that the Senate shall authorize the ratification of any treaty by the Government of Belize. Now therefore be it resolved that the Senate authorizes the Government of Belize to ratify the agreement relating to the Economic Development Cooperation Fund between the Government of Belize and the Government of the Republic of Korea.
Honorable members, that motion is referred to the Constitution and Foreign Affairs Committee for examination, consideration, and report. I recognize the Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I move that whereas Belize acceded to the International Sugar Agreement on the 24th of January 1994, and whereas member states of the International Sugar Organization approved the amendments of Articles 1, 23(1), 25, 32, 33, and 34 of the International Sugar Agreement 1992 on the 26th of November 2021, and whereas the Government of Belize is desirous of accepting the amendments to the agreement pursuant to Article 44 of the International Sugar Agreement, and whereas Section 61A(2)(a) of the Belize Constitution, as amended by the 6th Amendment Act No. 13 of 2008, provides that the Senate shall authorize the ratification or accession to any treaty by the Government of Belize. Now therefore be it resolved that this Senate authorizes the Government to accept the amendments to the International Sugar Agreement 1992.
Honorable members, that motion is referred to the Constitution and Foreign Affairs Committee for examination, consideration, and report. I recognize the Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I move that whereas Section 109(1) of the Belize Constitution provides that the Auditor General shall be appointed by the Governor General, acting on the recommendation of both houses of the National Assembly, contained in resolutions passed in that behalf. And whereas the post of the Auditor General has been vacant since August 31st, 2024, and whereas the government, having recognized that the post of Auditor General plays a critical role in safeguarding public trust by overseeing the use of taxpayers' monies and preventing misuse of resources, promotes transparency and embodies the principles of good governance, and whereas Maria Anel Rodriguez holds a master's degree in business administration from the University of South Wales and a Bachelor's of Science degree in accounting from the University of Belize, and whereas Maria Anel Rodriguez has considerable experience in the Office of the Auditor General and has held senior posts such as Supervisor of Audit and Deputy Auditor General, now therefore be it resolved that its Honorable House recommends that Maria Anel Rodriguez be appointed as Auditor General effective the 1st January 2025 until the 28th July 2024 resolution or a similar worded motion came before the Honorable Senate. It did not pass because serious concerns and reservations were expressed with respect to the temporary appointment of Ms. Rodriguez and the concern by senators that the process should have been exhausted. It is my understanding that the government has completed the process. Tender or applications were invited. People put in their applications. There was a complete vetting of the candidates and a process whereby they were interviewed. And Ms. Rodriguez was the #1 placed candidate as a result of that exercise. She enjoys, Madam President, the qualifications that are necessary for the position. She holds a master's in business administration and a bachelor's of science. She has considerable experience in the area of auditing. I hope that on this occasion we are able to fill this absolutely important constitutional position. The country cannot afford to continue without an Auditor General. Thank you, Madam President.
I recognize Senator Glenfield Dennison.
Obliged, Madam President. Madam President, with your permission, I wish to acknowledge the hardworking staff of the Office of the Auditor General, because the role of the Auditor General is very important, especially as it relates to the technical compliance and financial audits that need to be done by that office to ensure that the people are aware of what's happening with their monies. So I wish to acknowledge the Deputy Auditor Generals Maria Rodriguez and Selwyn Fuller, the Supervisors of Audits Ms. Kimberly Ellis, Jennifer Mavitt, Kimberly Lord, Andrea McGill, Marcia Riquenya, Lionel Callis, and Mrs. Ayala. I wish to acknowledge the Administrative Officer Doretta Pacheco, Examiners of Accounts Cynthia Caetano, Nikisha Ack, Shanice Greenwich, Barbara Martinez, Stacey Salam, Rodin Mogel. Sorry, Mr. Mogel, if I mash up your name. Edwin Zuniga, Gerald Henry, Tyrone Palmerson, Hubert Humes, Rani Lanza, Systems Administrator and Administrative Assistant, Ms. Lambia and Ms. St. Clair, Audit Secretary Jared Bennett. I was very impressed to see a male secretary. Audit clerks, Akima Jenkins, Wilfred Richards, Mrs. Lima, Bartholomew, Miss Parks, Rhonda Flowers, Miss Magdaleno, clerks Tanisha Ramdas, Agnes Novello, Michael Diaz, Dennis Andrew, Arlene Ireland, Beatrice Barbara, Jamal Williams, Miss Gentle, Miss Aldana, Asundon, Miss Gordon, Ms. Shepherd, Ms. Hewlett, Mr. Hewlett, Mr. Castillo, and Mr. Alvarado. That, as far as I know, Madam President, constitutes the staff of that very important office. It is not lost on me that the work that they do needs to continue and needs to be done. I wish, before I get into and thank you, thank you, members of that office, for your service to the country of Belize. As the Trade Union Congress Senator, it's very important for me to acknowledge what they are doing. I wish also to give a special thanks to Ms. Maria Rodriguez for her years of service that she has given to the office, and I wish to congratulate her on going through the interview process that was laid out by the powers that be, which resulted in her selection. That said, Madam President, I wish to address this Honorable House and the people of Belize on several matters, which include the promotion procedure within and the determination of seniority at that office, the selection process that's lacking in the Constitution for the Auditor General, issues that relate to the removal of the Auditor General from office, the appointment time and reappointment procedure that is a little lacking in the Constitution, as well as the fact that there is no laid out procedure for the remuneration of the Auditor General. These things have had, Madam President, a lot of buzz in and around Belize after the geniuses in the Senate did not support the motion the last time. I wish to highlight, Madam President, that there's a very close distinction between, and sometimes it looks like, genius and insanity. I flirt with that line very often, Madam President. I flirt with the line so depends on how you're looking, Madam President. Sometimes I can seem a bit insane. I'm very proud of that fact, though, actually. Or maybe genius, we can tell later. Madam President, the determination for seniority as it stands for public officers generally is something that really needs to be looked at in depth. In important offices like the Auditor General, as I like to call Fort Branch institutions, safeguard institutions, it's very important that qualifications and experience play a very important part in your upward mobility, but even more so, what is important are performance appraisals. This is how the people of Belize get to know that the people that they are paying in these offices are doing what they are hired to do, and that their competence is being tested and periodically reviewed. That, Madam President, is such a cornerstone of the public service because it's the people's money. And a lot has been said about bloating of the public service and so. However, I have never heard that used as it relates to the Office of the Auditor General. In fact, quite the opposite. I have always heard time and time again that they're understaffed, that they're underfunded, and that they need more resources. I wish to echo that call here that they do get the resources, including the use of technology that it would be necessary, because I can't remember having an audit report in this honorable House, Madam President. And I think that leaves a really bad taste in my mouth, because, let me wash it out. Because we don't know what's happening with our monies. And that is not something that should be taken lightly. So, a lot was said and a lot has been said about flaws in the upward mobility system that existed in the Office of the Auditor General. I will say no more than that we should pay keen attention. I want to go to the fact that we did do a publication of qualifications that were advertised for the filling of this post, including educational qualifications, professional associations and qualifications, as well as experience. As I understood the qualification criteria, Madam President, none of the applicants at the Office of the Auditor General would have had, except the two deputies, would have had any opportunity to fill the third criteria, which is 3 years as the Deputy Auditor General. So that distinct people with qualifications in auditing, like my friend in front here, were barred from applying for this very important post. People in the private sector, having not met that qualification, would have been discouraged by seeing that, I don't meet that criteria. So they would not have applied. So two people, Mr. Fuller and Ms. Rodriguez. I am told, and I'm reliably informed, that those who did apply did have the first qualification, the degree in accounting and masters in different fields, and so I think they would have been all on the same footing there. Where I am having to guess, Madam President, is as it relates to the second criteria, because this is the first time I am involved, well, the second time I'm involved in trying to appoint the Auditor General. But, Madam President, we are constitutionally required to recommend to the Governor General who becomes the Auditor General. That is not a function that is before anyone else. And I, without the benefit of understanding or participating in the procedure, but even more so, Madam President, I have absolutely no point of reference for Maria Anel Rodriguez. I was not furnished with her resume. I was not furnished with her qualifications. I was not furnished with anything other than my little Google searches on who she was. I was also unaware, and still remain so unaware, as to the qualifications of any other applicants. I understand that there were 3 people interviewed for this post, including Deputy Fuller, as well as Mr. Charles Flowers. And I have been reliably informed that there was a process that went through, for which I applaud. I'll come back to that. But we simply do not know, Madam President, what are we using to test the qualifications or the suitability of Ms. Rodriguez. That's important, Madam President, because it's not laid out specifically in the Constitution how you are to go about selecting an Auditor General. But what isn't there and is subject to the constitutional interpretation is whether or not the Prime Minister is to convene a interview panel, and they would be the one to select and to bring to us without more. That's dangerous, Madam President, because the Constitution says who's to make the recommendation, and I dislike having to make a recommendation without any information. So while I was going through my mind to see if I can come back to the side of genius, I sort of looked at other constitutional provisions that deal with the appointment of Auditor Generals. And I started to question why it was that there was not some sort of parliamentary committee, why it was that we could not have an opportunity to speak with the candidates who would have been applying for this post, so that we, who would be required to hold them to account for their reports, get a sort of say in the selection process. I'm not saying it's a requirement constitutionally, Madam President. What I'm saying is that it would go a long way in terms of best practices. This is a very important post. We are currently in constitutional reform exercise, a constitutional reform exercise, which may or may not make recommendations in relation to this office. However, I note the motion seeks to appoint Ms. Rodriguez until the age of 65. What I'm sure of, Madam President, is that any change to the Constitution could not affect her tenure if we would pass this motion. So if it is as a country we are looking at how these offices are to work with one another and the selection process is to go, then I want to respectfully suggest that we look at a sort of model where we could possibly look at appointing her in a longer tenured period than we had suggested, 4 months at the last time, but something that would not tie the people of Belize to an Auditor General who we don't know, who I don't know anything about, for 23 years, Madam President? 22 years. The danger with that, Madam President, is the jurisdictions that I look at that are very high in transparency and accountability, and I really like Singapore. They hire their Auditor General for 6 years, renewable after every 6 years. I like that approach, Madam President, and I recommend that sort of approach because more than 2 6-year terms have passed since we have received an Auditor General's report. And in circumstances like that, Madam President, it behooves me why it was that the Belize Advisory Council was not written to, maybe they were, I didn't write to them, to inquire as to the competence of the then sitting Auditor General, to inquire why we have not had an audit report, and the government either does what is necessary to fix the system flaws or remove the Auditor General. So I want to go on record, Madam President, that if I commit to the people of Belize that if this motion passes today and Ms. Rodriguez is appointed Auditor General, I will watchdog the audit of the Auditor General, because that is a very difficult position. Who audits the auditor? Who reflects on whether or not they are doing what is in the best interest of the country? And I will move and write repeatedly, if necessary, to whoever is Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Perfit, to ask that the Belize Advisory Council be moved to inquire into why it is we would not be getting audit reports. I want to I want to recommend to this House that there is no provisions for how we select the remuneration of an Auditor General. This is a very important post, Madam President. It is akin, in my mind, to that of a judge. It shares the similarity in the constitution of independence with offices like the office of the DPP, so that there's a sort of autonomy that needs to come with that office for the person to perform their function in a manner that would allow them to not have to worry about anything, including the high cost of living. I want to recommend, through whatever is the process, Madam President, that the Office of the Auditor General salary be reviewed and be elevated to that akin to a judge. Right now, it's my understanding that it's $175,000 a year tax-free, plus housing, plus vehicle, plus security, plus other allowances. For a judge, yeah, for the High Court, it goes up for president. But not only for offices like the Auditor General, Madam President. We are supposedly operating in co-equal arms of government. And it is very difficult to ask someone of your stature who has other professional obligations to give up your professional obligations that feed you, to donate your time and energies to an office such as Presidency of the Senate. So I further commend, Madam President, that we look at elevating offices like the DPP, like the President of the Senate, like the Speaker of the House of Representatives, to a sort of compensation that befits the office, befits the caliber of people that we wish to attract to the office, so that it is no longer community service, a labor of love, which it is for most everyone sitting here. I don't know that anyone here is reviewing these documents out of anything other than a labor of love. It can't be for the stipend. But to bring back a sort of dignity to the branches of government that need to balance power. And so, that is my call, Madam President, to elevate the status of these offices. And I dare say, if the motion doesn't pass today, re-advertise these sort of posts to allow for it to be attractive to people who would have retired in their accounting practice and would want to serve the people of Belize in these capacities without having to lower their standard of living. I think that is the sort of move that we should go towards to elevate the office. And I say it very cautiously, Madam President, because it's hard for me to say, after I just acknowledged all the people that work at the office, that Ono can't do the things that need to be done. I can never say that, but it's always a good idea to take fresh perspectives and new ideas and people who would have had experience in different areas to bring it to the fore to see what we can do to elevate that office to get the work done, Madam President. So I just want to close up, Madam President, in reminding that Section 109 is very clear. that in appointing an Auditor General, it is the Governor General who does it on the advice of these honorable houses. And so to ask the honorable members of these houses to, I despise using this term, Madam President, but to ask the members of this House to rubber stamp an application that we know nothing about would not result in the sort of development that we need as a country. And so, Madam President, I wish to ask for this particular motion to be voted on by division. I yield.
Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 10.8, I move that the proceedings on the order paper be entered upon and proceeded with at this day's sitting at any hour, though opposed.
Honorable members, the question is that the proceedings on the order paper may be entered upon and proceeded with at this day's sitting at any hour, though opposed. All those in favor kindly say aye. Aye. Those against kindly say no. The ayes have it. I recognize Senator Kevin Herrera.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, 20 years ago, I was intimately involved with the drafting of the Finance and Audit Reform Act of 2005. That was a time, you'll remember, when there was a lot of questions about the integrity of the integrity of our financial system. There were a lot of protests, there were a lot of demonstrations at that time. We were at the forefront of the Finance and Audit Reform Act at that time, and the Office of the Auditor General, because it's so crucial in terms of accountability and transparency within the system, which were really the issues that were identified at the time, that we actually dedicated a whole part of the Audit and Reform Act to the Auditor General and the accounts. And actually, 5 subsections of that act. And we did that because we didn't want to miss the point that we needed to hold the Auditor General accountable and responsible to generate the type of work and reports that we need to ensure that the integrity of the system is maintained. And so there are some specific timelines in terms of the generation of those reports, Madam President. Once the Accountant General submits those reports, the Auditor General has just 3 months to complete his or her report. And if there's an extension, then that has to come to the National Assembly, and only the National Assembly can grant that extension. Similarly for the Accountant General. The Accountant General has 3 months after the close of the financial year to complete his or her reports. And then he or she can ask for an additional 3 months. The Auditor General has 3 and 2. Accountant General has 3 and 3. That has never been done. I am not aware of any request coming from the Accountant General for an extension. Again, in complete violation of the Finance and Audit Reform Act. Madam President, I'm not generally cynical, but I'm beginning to get the feel that these systems perhaps are not supposed to work for some reason or the other. For example, if we talk about the delayed reports, the last Auditor General report was 2014-2015, I believe. 90% of the time you'll be talking about the Auditor General. And sometimes when you think about it, you say, well, we're probably most of the time missing the most significant issue in here. Because the Auditor General cannot audit accounts that were not submitted. And this is the point we keep on missing. We miss it every time. And because we miss it, we give the administration a free pass. We have to understand that the critical, important issue facing us right now, in terms of the delayed reports, are because the Accountant General is backed up and is not submitting the accounts for the Auditor General to audit. We cannot miss this point, Madam President, and every opportunity I get to repeat it, I repeat it because I want it to catch on. We cannot miss this point. And I go back to the point I made. Sometimes perhaps the system is not designed to work because the Accountant General is supposed to report to the Financial Secretary, and the Financial Secretary reports to the Minister of Finance. But who's holding the Accountant General accountable and keeping her on track with respect to the submission of these reports? This is a direct function of the executive, and yet they've been failing since independence on it, and no one has corrected it. There seems to be very little interest in this aspect of it, Madam President, and again, we keep on, with all the flurs and election is going, and everybody will be beating their chest about how many roads they're building, but nobody's checking about whether we're getting value for money, whether these things are being audited, but everybody feels so proud. And to me, there is not much to celebrate from an accountability standpoint. I think we should really be ashamed of ourselves because we've done a very, very poor job in this regard. Madam President, for us to really fix, and I serve on the Joint Public Accounts Committee, and we brought in the Accountant General several times, Auditor General several times. But there's only so far we can go with this. The Accountant General needs to submit those reports for it to work. But then we ask ourselves, well, what next? And so my appeal is to the executive to continue to push and hold the Accountant General responsible to get these reports in on time. I think that the national budget is growing every year. The economy is growing every year. And so there'll be a more and more need, a larger system to look at. And so we have to continue to push for the Accountant General to do his or her work and the Auditor General to close in and make sure that everything is being spent properly. This is a major weakness that we continue to see in the system, Madam President. And then you coming back to the Auditor General, Madam President, is, I studied accounting, I did the CPA, and when you are practicing, there are certain criteria you have to meet, there are certain exams you have to pass. And I see it in terms of the ad for the Auditor General, these things listed. But I'm not sure if the current individual, Ms. Rodriguez, I believe, Mrs. Rodriguez, I don't know if we maintained that demand that the person who we're selecting has those qualifications. But irrespective, you can't really blame the persons who applied for it, Madam President, because at $50,000, what I understand the package to be, you won't really get much qualified individual at that level to work in there. And so if there were 3 persons who applied, I believe there could have been a lot more if the position had matched the compensation package, like what my colleague mentioned a little earlier. And so that is an important point. And again, there seems to be, with respect to this audit, Madam President, there's quite a bit of misfits that I think we have to put it back in alignment. Madam President, the coming to the motion now, the appointment of the Auditor General is done under Section 109, subsection 1 of the Belize Constitution. And I noticed in the motion, and I had mentioned to the leader of government business a little earlier, and I had stepped out of the room, so I don't know if he had mentioned it, but 109 subsection 4 states that the Auditor General should vacate office at the age of 60. I noticed that the motion has